Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into a gaslit Victorian bedroom where you're carefully draping black cloth over your vanity mirror, heart racing as shadows dance across floral wallpaper. The year is 1887, and you've just learned that leaving mirrors uncovered after dark is basically rolling out a red carpet for demons. You probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in a Victorian house at night without having a complete nervous breakdown over all the supernatural rules you'd accidentally break. If you enjoy strange, sleepy history, hit like and subscribe. It helps me make more of these bizarre bedtime stories. Tell me your city and what time you're listening. I always check these comments and love seeing night owls from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some white noise, and let's slide into tonight's story about why our great-great-grandparents were absolutely terrified of their own reflections. You're standing in your Victorian bedroom, and that ornate mirror above your dressing table isn't just furniture, it's a potential gateway to hell. Seriously, Victorians believed mirrors were thin spots between our world and the spirit realm, like cosmic windows that demons could peer through or even step out of. During daylight hours, your reflection was safely yours, but once darkness fell, anything could be staring back. The fear wasn't entirely irrational by Victorian standards. These people lived through cholera outbreaks, industrial accidents, and medical procedures without anesthesia. Death was constantly knocking at their door. So when spiritualism exploded in popularity during the 1840s, mirrors became focal points for supernatural anxiety. You'd cover them with heavy black cloth, creating what looks like a funeral shroud over every reflective surface in your home. Historians still argue whether this practice originated from Jewish mourning traditions or older European folklore, but Victorians made it their own neurotic art form. Your wealthy neighbour might have 15 mirrors to cover each night, turning bedtime into an elaborate ritual of draping and tucking fabric. Miss even one small hand mirror, and you'd spend the night convinced something was watching you from the glass. The most popular theory was that mirrors trapped souls of the dead, like supernatural flypaper. If Great Aunt Gertrude died in front of your bedroom mirror, part of her essence might be stuck there forever, growing more malevolent with each passing night. You'd peer into that mirror and maybe catch a glimpse of her angry ghost, furious about being trapped in silvered glass instead of moving on to whatever Victorian heaven looks like. Probably lots of doilies and proper tea service. But here's where it gets deliciously weird. Some Victorians believed mirrors could steal pieces of your living soul too. Each time you looked at your reflection in darkness, you were supposedly leaving behind a fragment of yourself. Look too often, and you'd become a hollow shell, while your mirror accumulated enough soul stuff to animate its own twisted reflection of you. Imagine waking up to find your mirror self had crawled out during the night and was rearranging your furniture with malicious intent. The paranoia reached such heights that mirror manufacturers started advertising spiritually neutral mirrors, claiming their glass was blessed or treated with special processes to prevent supernatural infiltration. It was basically the Victorian equivalent of selling ghost-proof smartphones, and people absolutely bought into it. Your mirror wasn't just reflecting light anymore. It was a potential portal, prison, and soul-sucking device, all rolled into one terrifying piece of bedroom furniture. Smart Victorians kept consecrated salt around their mirrors, because apparently demons were like supernatural slugs that couldn't handle sodium. You'd sprinkle it on the frame and whisper prayers, turning your vanity into a makeshift altar. The really paranoid ones slept with mirrors facing the wall year-round, because why take chances with your eternal soul over vanity? You're lying in your sickbed, fever burning through your Victorian nightgown, when your devoted sister makes a fatal mistake. She angles the bedside mirror so you can see yourself one last time before you die. According to Victorian belief, she's just doomed your soul to wander the earth forever, trapped between worlds, because you glimpsed your own dying reflection. The Victorians had turned death into an intricate supernatural chess game, and mirrors were the most dangerous pieces on the board. If you saw yourself in a mirror during your final moments, your soul would supposedly become confused about which side of the glass it belonged on. Instead of peacefully departing for the afterlife, you'd be stuck haunting your own reflection, growing more bitter and twisted with each passing year. This wasn't just superstition. It was serious business that shaped how Victorians approached deathbed scenes. Family members would frantically cover every mirror in the house the moment someone took a turn for the worse, racing against time to prevent accidental soul trapping. Your loving relatives would literally be draping furniture while you're gasping your last breaths, because apparently interior decorating was more urgent than holding your hand. Historians still argue whether this practice prevented more deaths than it caused, considering all the stress and chaos it added to already tragic situations. But Victorians were convinced that dying while looking at yourself created the most dangerous type of ghost, one that remembered being alive and resented being trapped. Your reflection would supposedly retain all your memories, personality, and grudges, but with supernatural powers and infinite time to nurse its resentments. The fear was so intense that some families hired death watchers, professional sitters whose job was to monitor mirrors during someone's final hours. These women would position themselves strategically around the sick room, ready to throw cloth over any reflective surface the moment the dying person's eyes wandered toward glass. It was like having a bouncer for your soul, except instead of checking IDs, they were preventing eternal damnation. But here's the twisted part. Some Victorians believed that if you deliberately looked into a mirror while dying, you could choose to become a protective spirit instead of a vengeful one. This led to secret deathbed mirror-gazing cults, where people would arrange to see their reflection during their final moments, hoping to become benevolent family guardians. Imagine explaining that career choice at a dinner party. Oh, I help people become ghosts professionally. The most chilling stories involve children who accidentally saw themselves dying in mirrors. Victorian parents were terrified that innocent souls would become the most powerful and unpredictable spirits because they lacked the adult understanding to accept death peacefully. A child's ghost created by mirror death was supposedly capable of reshaping reality itself, turning your home into a nightmare playground where the laws of physics bent to accommodate a confused dead toddler's whims. Wealthy families installed elaborate mirror covering systems in their homes, with pulleys and counterweights that could instantly shroud every reflective surface at the tug of a rope. Poor families made do with sheets and prayers, but everyone participated in this macabre dance between life, death, and reflection. Your deathbed became a carefully orchestrated performance where mirrors played the villain. The really paranoid Victorians avoided mirrors entirely during illness, convinced that even healthy people could accidentally trap part of their soul if they looked too sick in their reflection. Remember that soul fragment theory from earlier? Well, combine it with Victorian medical ignorance, and you get people who thought looking pale in a mirror could actually make you die faster, creating a supernatural feedback loop of doom. Some doctors of the era actually recommended removing mirrors from sick rooms, not because they believed in soul trapping, but because they noticed patients became more anxious and depressed when they could see their own deteriorating appearance. It was accidentally good medicine based on completely bonkers reasoning, the Victorian equivalent of being right for all the wrong reasons. You're sitting in Mrs. Pemberton's lavishly decorated parlour, gasping as she unveils an enormous mirror propped against the mantelpiece. Tonight's séance centerpiece that's supposed to help you chat with your dead husband Harold. What could possibly go wrong with using reflective glass as a supernatural telephone? Spoiler alert, absolutely everything, according to the dozens of Victorian families who tried this and ended up with permanent house guests from beyond the grave. Victorian séances were basically supernatural dinner parties where the guests of honour were dead people, and mirrors served as the ultimate party trick, Spiritualists claimed that mirrors could amplify psychic energy, creating clearer connections between the living and the dead. You'd gather around a large mirror with your fellow mourners, holding hands and staring into the glass while chanting Harold's name, hoping his face would materialize among your reflections. The problem was that Victorians had no quality control for their ghost summoning. You might be trying to contact Harold, but the mirror could just as easily attract any random spirit floating around the neighbourhood. Imagine calling for pizza and accidentally getting connected to a medieval plague victim who's been waiting centuries for someone to listen to his complaints about dying in a ditch. That's essentially what happened during mirror seances, spiritual crossed wires that brought unwanted supernatural visitors into your home. Professional mediums made fortunes off mirror seances, claiming they could control which spirits appeared in the glass. They dim the lights, burn specific incenses, and position the mirror at precise angles to create an otherworldly atmosphere. Historians still argue whether these mediums were talented performers or genuine psychics, but they definitely knew how to manipulate Victorian grief into cold, hard cash. The really wealthy Victorians invested in custom spirit mirrors, specially manufactured glass that supposedly had enhanced supernatural conductivity. These mirrors cost more than most people's annual salaries, but grieving families would pay anything for a chance to see their loved ones again. You'd essentially be buying the most expensive piece of haunted furniture ever created, guaranteed to either connect you with the dead or drive you completely insane trying. But here's where the seance mirror madness gets genuinely terrifying. Participants often reported seeing faces that didn't belong to anyone they'd summoned. Strange children would appear in the glass, staring out with ancient eyes. Victorian women would glimpse their own faces aged decades, as if the mirror was showing them their future deaths. Men would see themselves with wounds they'd never received, suggesting the mirror was displaying alternate timelines or prophetic visions. The most disturbing accounts involved mirrors that retained images after seances ended. You'd finish your supernatural phone call with Harold, cover the mirror, and then discover the next morning that faces were still visible in the glass. Sometimes Harold, sometimes strangers, sometimes twisted versions of the living participants. Your mirror had basically become a supernatural recording device that couldn't be turned off. Some Victorian families became addicted to mirror seances, holding them nightly and gradually losing touch with reality. They'd spend more time talking to reflections than living people, convinced that the mirror world was more real than their actual lives. Remember that soul fragment theory? These families were supposedly feeding pieces of themselves to the mirror until they became hollow shells, while their reflections grew more solid and lifelike. The Catholic Church eventually banned mirror seances, declaring them demonic rather than spiritual. Protestant churches were more divided, with some ministers participating in seances, while others preached that mirrors were Satan's windows into Christian homes. Your Sunday sermon might include warnings about reflective glass, right alongside traditional moral guidance. Love thy neighbour, honour thy parents, and for God's sake, don't try to video call dead people through your vanity mirror. The seance craze produced some genuinely bizarre Victorian inventions, including mirror telegraphs that claimed to send messages directly to the spirit world. You'd write a note, hold it up to the mirror, and supposedly deceased relatives could read it from the other side. It was like texting ghosts, except with more candles and dramatically increased chances of demonic possession. You're settling into your Victorian bedroom for the night when suddenly you realise you've committed the ultimate supernatural sin. You've left your window curtains open, basically sending an engraved invitation to every ghost, demon, and malevolent spirit within a 50-mile radius to come peek into your private space. According to Victorian wisdom, uncovered windows at night were like leaving your front door wide open in a neighbourhood full of supernatural burglars. Windows weren't just architectural features to Victorians, they were potential breach points in your home's spiritual defences. During darkness, your cozy bedroom window transformed into a one-way mirror that allowed entities from the other side to observe you while you slept, completely vulnerable and unaware. You'd be snoring peacefully while some Victorian ghost was essentially binge-watching your dreams, like they were the latest supernatural Netflix series. The fear was so pervasive that Victorian homes featured the heaviest, most elaborate window treatments in history. We're talking about curtains thick enough to stop bullets, layered like medieval armour against the supernatural. Your bedroom window might have sheer curtains, heavy drapes, wooden shutters, and decorative valances, basically building a textile fortress between your sleeping form and whatever was lurking outside in the darkness. Historians still argue whether this obsession with covered windows stemmed from legitimate security concerns or pure supernatural paranoia, but Victorians treated it like a matter of life and death. You'd methodically check every window before bed, ensuring not even a sliver of glass remained exposed. Miss one small bathroom window, and you'd spend the night convinced that something was watching you brush your teeth with malevolent interest. But here's where Victorian window fears get deliciously weird. They believed that spirits could become trapped between window panes, creating permanent supernatural residence in your walls. Double-paned windows were particularly dangerous because they created a spiritual pocket dimension where ghosts could hide indefinitely. You might hear tapping from inside your windows on windless nights, not branches or settling wood, but frustrated spirits trying to communicate from their glass prison. The really paranoid Victorians installed blessed window frames, having clergy sprinkle holy water on the wood and metal before installation. Some families paid extra for windows made from sanctified sand, claiming that glass produced from blessed materials couldn't be penetrated by evil forces. It was basically the Victorian equivalent of supernatural home security systems, except instead of cameras and alarms, you had prayers and consecrated building materials. Victorian children were taught elaborate bedtime rituals around window covering, turning curtain drawing into a protective ceremony. You'd close the drapes while reciting specific prayers or counting backwards from certain numbers, believing that the ritual itself created spiritual barriers. Parents would check their children's windows multiple times each night, because apparently demonic possession was more concerning than sleep deprivation. The fear extended beyond just being watched. Victorians believed that uncovered windows could drain your life force while you slept. They thought your soul was most vulnerable during dreams, and exposed windows would allow malevolent spirits to siphon away your spiritual energy like supernatural vampires. You'd wake up exhausted, not because you needed more sleep, but because some ghost had been feeding off your essence all night through your bedroom window. Some Victorian houses featured windows that couldn't be opened at all, permanently sealed to prevent any supernatural infiltration. Families would choose suffocation risk over spirit invasion, installing elaborate ventilation systems rather than risk cracking a window after dark. Remember those seance mirrors we discussed? Well, combine that spiritual paranoia with windows, and you get families living in virtual bunkers against the supernatural. The wealthy could afford spirit-proof window treatments, curtains woven with silver thread, blessed by multiple clergy members and treated with protective oils and herbs. Poor families made do with whatever heavy fabric they could find, but everyone participated in this nightly ritual of sealing themselves away from the spirit world. Your evening routine included more supernatural protection than actual hygiene, because apparently clean teeth mattered less than ghost-proofing your bedroom. You're creeping up your Victorian staircase in the middle of the night, candle flickering in your trembling hand, when suddenly you freeze. There's definitely something standing on the landing above you, just beyond the circle of your candlelight. According to Victorian belief, staircases were supernatural highways where shadow people congregated like commuters waiting for the midnight ghost train, and you've just stumbled into rush hour for the undead. Victorian staircases weren't just architectural features, they were vertical battlegrounds between the living and the dead. The theory was that spirits found it easier to manifest on stairs because the angled space created spiritual in-between zones where the normal rules of reality became negotiable. Your innocent trip to the bathroom at 2 a.m. suddenly became a supernatural obstacle course where each step might bring you face to face with someone who'd been dead for decades. The shadow people were supposedly different from regular ghosts. They were the dark outlines of spirits who couldn't fully materialize but refused to move on to whatever came next. Victorians described them as human-shaped patches of deeper darkness that would stand motionless on stair landings, in corners where steps turned, or pressed against staircase walls, like flat, malevolent wallpaper. You'd glimpse them in your peripheral vision, but they'd vanish the moment you looked directly at them. Historians still argue whether these shadow people were hallucinations caused by poor lighting and overactive imaginations, or if Victorians were genuinely encountering something supernatural on their staircases. But the reports were remarkably consistent across different families, social classes, and geographic regions. Everyone seemed to be meeting the same dark figures in the same staircase locations. The most chilling accounts involved shadow people who would follow you up or downstairs, always staying just outside your light source. You'd hear footsteps matching your own rhythm, but see nothing when you turned around. Victorian children were taught to never run on stairs at night because sudden movements supposedly triggered aggressive responses from shadow people. Your innocent midnight dash to the privy could escalate into a supernatural chase scene that ended with you barricaded in your bedroom, praying until dawn. But here's where Victorian stair paranoia reaches peak absurdity. Wealthy families hired stair watchers, servants whose job was to monitor staircases during nighttime hours. These poor souls would sit at the bottom of the stairs with lanterns, supposedly keeping shadow people at bay through constant vigilance. Imagine explaining that job to your mother. I professionally stare at stairs all night to prevent ghost encounters. Some Victorian houses featured elaborate staircase blessing rituals, with clergy coming monthly to sprinkle holy water on every step and banister. The really paranoid families installed multiple landings and sharp turns, believing that shadow people couldn't navigate complex staircase layouts. Your trip between floors became like navigating a spiritual maze designed to confuse supernatural entities, which probably confused living residents just as much. The shadow people supposedly had preferences for certain types of staircases. Wooden stairs attracted more spirits than stone ones, curved staircases were more dangerous than straight ones, and stairs with open railings were basically supernatural superhighways. Victorian architects started designing spirit-resistant staircases with specific proportions, materials, and configurations intended to discourage paranormal activity. Victorian servants developed their own shadow people folklore, claiming that the spirits were former household staff who died while working and couldn't stop performing their duties. Your shadow person might be a long-dead butler still making his nightly rounds, or a deceased maid forever climbing stairs to tend bedrooms that no longer needed her services. Remember those séance mirrors? Well, some families would position mirrors on stair landings, believing they could trap shadow people in reflective glass rather than allowing them to roam freely. The really disturbing stories involved shadow people who would grab at Victorian clothing or hair while people climbed stairs. Women reported feeling invisible hands tugging at their nightgowns, while men described cold fingers running along their backs as they ascended. Children would arrive at the top of stairs with mysterious bruises or scratches, allegedly left by shadow people who tried to pull them back down into darkness. You're preparing dinner in your Victorian kitchen when your clumsy scullery maid drops a carving knife, and it lands point first in the wooden floor. Congratulations! You've just cursed your entire household for the next 7 years, because apparently Gravity has supernatural consequences when it involves sharp objects. According to Victorian superstition, a falling knife wasn't just an accident, it was a cosmic announcement that death was coming to visit your family, probably sometime before the roast finished cooking. Victorian kitchens were minefields of supernatural significance, where every utensil carried mystical weight beyond its practical purpose. Knives were especially dangerous because they represented the thin line between life and death. One moment you're slicing bread, the next you're accidentally summoning the Grim Reaper through poor cutlery management. Your innocent cooking preparations became elaborate rituals designed to prevent accidentally cursing everyone you fed. The knife superstitions were incredibly specific and completely bonkers. If a knife fell and stuck in the floor, someone in the house would die within the year. If it fell flat, you'd have unexpected visitors, potentially living ones, which was actually the better outcome. Cross two knives accidentally, and you'd create a spiritual portal that allowed demons to enter your kitchen. Victorians basically treated their silverware drawer like a supernatural weapons cache that required constant vigilance. Historians still argue whether these beliefs originated from actual kitchen accidents that preceded family tragedies, or if they were just Victorian anxiety manifesting through everyday objects. But families took knife superstitions so seriously that they'd hire kitchen consultants to arrange their cutlery in spiritually safe configurations. Your meal prep required more mystical planning than actual cooking knowledge. But here's where Victorian knife paranoia gets genuinely weird. They believed that knives could absorb the emotional energy of everyone who handled them. A knife used to prepare meals during arguments would supposedly become cursed, infecting every future dish with family discord. Wedding gift cutlery sets came with elaborate blessing ceremonies to ensure they'd only channel loving energy into newlywed meals. Your kitchen knives weren't just tools, they were emotional storage devices that could poison relationships through contaminated food preparation. The really superstitious Victorians never washed their knives with other dishes, believing that mixing knife energy with plates and spoons would spread curses throughout their entire kitchen arsenal. Special knife washing rituals involve specific prayers, blessed water, and careful attention to which direction you wiped the blade. Clean your knife wrong, and you might accidentally activate dormant supernatural properties that would turn your next dinner party into a séance. Victorian servants developed elaborate knife handling protocols to prevent accidental cursing. You'd pass knives handle first to avoid transferring negative energy, never point blades toward family members, and store them in specific patterns that supposedly neutralized mystical build-up. Kitchen maids spent more time learning supernatural knife etiquette than actual culinary skills, because apparently proper blade positioning was more important than food safety. Some Victorian families owned inherited curse knives, cutlery passed down through generations that supposedly carried the accumulated supernatural baggage of every previous owner. These knives were treated like family heirlooms and spiritual time bombs simultaneously. You'd use great-grandmother's carving knife for special occasions while secretly terrified that it might still be holding grudges from decades-old dinner parties. The fear extended to knife sharpening, which Victorians believed could either remove curses or intensify them, depending on the sharpener's spiritual state. Professional knife sharpeners advertised their ability to cleanse blades of supernatural contamination, essentially offering mystical maintenance for your cutlery. Remember those shadow people on staircases? Well, some Victorians believed that improperly maintained knives could attract shadow people to their kitchens, drawn by the spiritual instability of cursed cutlery. Victorian cookbook authors included knife blessing recipes alongside actual food instructions, treating spiritual cleansing as essential kitchen knowledge. You'd learn how to prepare pot roast and how to exercise your carving knife in the same manual, because apparently both skills were equally necessary for successful household management. Your kitchen wasn't just a place to cook, it was a supernatural battlefield where proper knife etiquette could mean the difference between a pleasant meal and a family curse. You're standing in your Victorian doorway at precisely midnight, sprinkling salt across the threshold while muttering ancient protective words. Because apparently, your front door is less of an entrance and more of a supernatural checkpoint where you need to show proper spiritual identification to keep demons from waltzing into your parlour. According to Victorian belief, doorways were cosmic weak points, where the barrier between worlds grew thin, requiring elaborate guardian rituals that made airport security look casual. Victorian thresholds weren't just architectural transitions, they were mystical battlegrounds where good and evil forces constantly wrestled for control of your domestic space. The theory was that doorways existed in a spiritual grey area, neither fully inside nor outside, creating perfect conditions for supernatural entities to slip between dimensions. Your innocent act of opening the door to collect morning milk could accidentally invite centuries-old curses into your breakfast routine. The protective rituals were absurdly complex and varied by region, social class, and family tradition. Some Victorians buried iron nails under their doorsteps, believing that metal created spiritual barriers against evil forces. Others planted specific herbs around their entrances: rosemary for protection, sage for cleansing, garlic for keeping vampires from joining dinner uninvited. Your front garden became less about curb appeal and more about supernatural pest control. Historians still argue whether these threshold protection rituals actually worked or just made Victorians feel safer in an uncertain world, but families passed down doorway guardian ceremonies like precious heirlooms. You'd learn the proper salt sprinkling technique from your grandmother, who learned it from her grandmother, creating an unbroken chain of mystical door maintenance spanning generations. But here's where Victorian doorway paranoia reaches magnificent levels of complexity. They believed different types of the visitors required different protective measures. A salt line might stop demons, but it could also prevent beneficial spirits like deceased relatives from entering to offer guidance. Holy water worked against evil entities, but might offend non-Christian supernatural beings who were actually trying to help. Your doorway became a cosmic customs office where you needed different spiritual visas for different types of otherworldly visitors. The wealthy Victorians commissioned elaborate threshold blessing ceremonies from multiple religious authorities, hedging their supernatural bets by getting Protestant, Catholic, and sometimes even pagan protections installed simultaneously. Poor families made do with folk remedies passed down through oral tradition, sweeping counterclockwise, hanging specific symbols, or reciting protective prayers while touching the doorframe. Remember those cursed kitchen knives? Well, some families would bury their oldest knife under the threshold, believing that familiar objects would recognize and repel unfamiliar spirits. Victorian door construction incorporated supernatural considerations alongside practical ones. Threshold stones were selected for mystical properties as well as durability. Door frames included hidden compartments for protective talismans. Some families installed elaborate door knocker systems that supposedly announced visitors to both living occupants and spiritual guardians, essentially creating a supernatural doorbell that worked across multiple dimensions. The most paranoid Victorians never opened doors during specific hours, usually midnight to dawn, believing that nighttime doorway openings created larger spiritual breach points. Emergency situations requiring door access during forbidden hours involved elaborate protective rituals, blessed candles, and sometimes multiple family members forming prayer circles around the entrance. Your simple trip to the privy became a group spiritual expedition requiring divine intervention. Victorian servants were trained in proper doorway etiquette, learning which foot to step over thresholds first, how to hold protective objects while opening doors, and specific phrases to recite when admitting visitors. The really superstitious households required servants to sprinkle fresh salt across every threshold daily, creating a supernatural maintenance routine that kept housekeepers busy with mystical housework alongside actual cleaning. Some Victorian families believed their doorway guardian rituals became more powerful over time, accumulating spiritual strength through repetition and faith. Multi-generational homes supposedly had the strongest threshold protections, layered with decades of daily protective ceremonies. Your family doorway wasn't just an entrance, it was a mystical fortress, strengthened by years of careful spiritual maintenance, where each generation added their own protective elements to an ever-growing supernatural security system. You're sitting in your Victorian parlour as evening shadows lengthen, watching your candle flame suddenly flicker and dance without any breeze, when you realise with growing horror that something invisible is moving through your room. Because according to Victorian wisdom, candlelight didn't just illuminate your space, it revealed the supernatural creatures that were always there, invisible until fire exposed their ghostly presence, like cosmic blacklight showing hidden stains. Victorian candles weren't just sources of illumination, they were supernatural detection devices that could expose spiritual activity invisible to the naked eye. The theory was that flames existed in a mystical middle ground between the physical and spiritual worlds, making them sensitive to otherworldly presences. Your innocent evening reading session became a supernatural surveillance operation where every flicker, sputter, or colour change in your candle flame spelled out messages from beyond the grave. The flame interpretations were incredibly detailed and completely terrifying. A candle that burned steadily meant you were alone with the living, but flames that danced without wind indicated ghostly visitors moving through your space. Blue flames supposedly revealed the presence of spirits who died peacefully, while red or green flames warned of malevolent entities with violent histories. Your candle became a supernatural mood ring that displayed the emotional state of invisible roommates. Historians still argue whether Victorians were genuinely detecting paranormal activity or just interpreting normal combustion variations through supernatural anxiety. But families treated candlelight divination as seriously as modern people check weather forecasts. You'd position candles strategically throughout your home, creating a network of spiritual early warning systems that could alert you to supernatural intrusions before they became dangerous. But here's where Victorian candle paranoia gets deliciously weird. They believed that certain types of wax attracted specific kinds of spirits. Beeswax candles supposedly drew helpful household spirits who'd assist with daily chores, while tallow candles, made from animal fat, attracted hungrier, more aggressive entities. Church candles blessed by clergy were premium spiritual detection equipment, but they also cost more than most families could afford for daily use. The really superstitious Victorians never extinguished candles by blowing them out, convinced that sudden darkness would trap whatever spirits the flame had revealed, leaving them invisible but still present in your room. Proper candle extinction required snuffers or careful pinching, allowing detected spirits time to retreat back to whatever dimension they'd emerged from. Your bedtime routine included more supernatural consideration than actual sleep preparation. Victorian children were taught elaborate candle safety rules that had nothing to do with fire prevention and everything to do with spiritual protection. Never carry a candle backwards through doorways, because you might accidentally invite spirits to follow you. Always light new candles from existing flames rather than matches, because sustained fire maintained better spiritual continuity. Count the number of flickers in your bedtime candle. Odd numbers meant peaceful sleep. Even numbers suggested restless nights ahead. Some Victorian families maintained sentinel candles that burned continuously in specific rooms, creating permanent supernatural monitoring stations throughout their homes. These candles required constant attention and replacement, essentially employing family members as full-time spiritual security guards. Remember those shadow people on staircases? Well, sentinel candles positioned on stair landings supposedly kept shadow people from ascending to upper floors, creating flame barriers against supernatural trespassers. The wealthy could afford elaborate candelabras designed for maximum spiritual detection, with multiple flames positioned to reveal supernatural activity from different angles. Poor families made do with single candles and sharp eyes, but everyone participated in this nightly ritual of flame watching and spirit spotting. Your evening entertainment involved more supernatural surveillance than actual relaxation. Victorian candle makers advertised their products' spiritual detection capabilities alongside burn time and brightness, marketing wax blends specifically formulated for paranormal sensitivity. Enhanced spiritual visibility became a selling point for premium candles, essentially creating a supernatural technology industry based on improved ghost spotting equipment. Your shopping decisions involved comparing mystical effectiveness ratings rather than just practical considerations like cost and availability. The most disturbing accounts involved candles that revealed spirits but couldn't make them leave, creating supernatural stalemates where families could see ghostly visitors but had no way to remove them. You'd spend entire evenings watching invisible entities move through your candlelit parlour, completely aware of supernatural trespassers but powerless to evict them from your home. You're climbing the creaking stairs to your Victorian attic to retrieve Christmas decorations, oil lamp casting dancing shadows on the walls, when you suddenly realise you've entered the most spiritually dangerous room in your entire house. Because according to Victorian belief, attics were supernatural storage units where displaced spirits congregated like homeless ghosts looking for rent-free accommodation in your uppermost floor. Victorian attics weren't just extra storage space, they were spiritual dumping grounds where the supernatural overflow from your house naturally accumulated. The theory was that ghosts like heat rose to the highest available space, making your attic a supernatural penthouse suite for every spirit that had ever visited your home and decided to stay permanently. Your innocent seasonal decoration retrieval became a journey into a spiritual refugee camp filled with decades of ghostly squatters. The fear was so pervasive that many Victorian families simply avoided their attics entirely, preferring to lose valuable storage space rather than risk supernatural encounters. You'd stuff belongings into every other available space, under beds, behind furniture, in basement corners, rather than venture into the ghost-infested upper reaches of your own home. Some families sealed their attic entrances permanently, essentially writing off entire floors to avoid spiritual confrontations. Historians still argue whether Victorian attic fears stemmed from legitimate structural sounds and drafts, or genuine supernatural experiences, but the reports were remarkably consistent across different households. Families described hearing footsteps above their bedrooms at night, furniture being dragged across attic floors by invisible hands, and voices having conversations in languages no living family member recognised. But here's where Victorian attic paranoia reaches peak absurdity. They believed that stored objects could become spiritually contaminated by prolonged attic exposure. Your grandmother's wedding dress left in the attic for a few years might absorb enough ghostly energy to become actively haunted. Seasonal decorations supposedly picked up spiritual hitchhikers during attic storage, bringing supernatural visitors down into your living spaces when you retrieved them for holidays. The really paranoid Victorians hired attic cleansers, spiritual janitors who would venture into upper floors with blessed candles, holy water, and protective prayers to perform supernatural house cleaning. These brave souls would spend hours in ghost-infested attics, attempting to negotiate with spirits, banish unwanted entities, and generally tidy up the supernatural mess that had accumulated in your rafters. Victorian attic construction reflected these supernatural concerns, with builders installing specific ventilation patterns intended to prevent spiritual stagnation, blessed support beams to discourage ghostly nesting, and sometimes even small altars or religious symbols built directly into the structure. Your attic wasn't just architectural afterthought. It was a carefully designed spiritual containment system. Some families developed elaborate attic monitoring systems, positioning mirrors at strategic angles to observe upper floors without actually entering them. Remember those dangerous seance mirrors? Well, attic surveillance mirrors were their practical cousins, designed for supernatural reconnaissance rather than spirit communication. You could check whether your attic was currently occupied by ghosts without risking direct supernatural contact. Victorian children were absolutely forbidden from playing in attics, not because of safety concerns about falls or structural damage, but because young souls were supposedly more vulnerable to spiritual influence. Parents worried that children might become spiritually adopted by attic ghosts, gradually spending more time with supernatural playmates than living family members until they eventually joined the ghostly community permanently. The wealthy could afford professionally blessed attic spaces, with clergy performing annual spiritual maintenance to keep supernatural accumulation under control. Poor families relied on folk remedies like iron nails hammered into support beams, salt sprinkled in corners, and specific herbs hung from rafters to discourage ghostly settlement. Remember those cursed kitchen knives? Some families would bury old cutlery in attic floorboards, believing that familiar objects would make spirits feel unwelcome in unfamiliar territory. The most chilling Victorian attic stories involve families who heard their own voices coming from upper floors. Conversations and activities that supposedly involved their ghostly doubles living parallel lives in the spiritual realm above their heads. You'd be having dinner downstairs while your supernatural family was apparently having their own ghostly meal in the attic, creating an unsettling echo of domestic life, one floor above reality. You're descending into your Victorian basement to fetch coal for the evening fire, lamp flame guttering in the damp air, when you hear something large shifting behind the coal pile, and suddenly you realise you've entered the domain of the coal demons, supernatural entities that Victorians believed fed on the darkness and heat of basement furnaces, like subterranean vampires with a taste for fossil fuels. Victorian basements weren't just storage cellars, they were underground lairs where the most dangerous supernatural creatures made their homes. The theory was that demons preferred the deepest, darkest spaces available, making your basement a supernatural hotel that catered specifically to entities too evil for ground-level haunting. Your simple trip to gather heating fuel became a descent into what was essentially Hell's branch office, conveniently located directly beneath your kitchen. Coal demons were supposedly attracted to the combination of darkness, earth, and combustible materials that made basements perfect supernatural breeding grounds. Unlike regular ghosts who might just rearrange your furniture or slam doors, coal demons were actively malevolent entities that could influence your home's heating system, potentially poisoning your family through contaminated warmth or causing mysterious fires that started from within the coal itself. Historians still argue whether coal demon fears stemmed from legitimate concerns about carbon monoxide poisoning and spontaneous combustion, or genuine supernatural experiences, but Victorian families took basement spiritual threats seriously enough to reshape their entire home heating strategies. Some families hired coal delivery men who doubled as amateur exorcists, blessing fuel shipments before storing them in potentially demon-infested cellars. But here's where Victorian basement paranoia gets magnificently complex. They believed different types of fuel attracted different classes of demons. Anthracite coal supposedly drew sophisticated demons with refined tastes for high-quality heat, while cheaper bituminous coal attracted crude, aggressive entities that were basically the supernatural equivalent of coal dust, messy, persistent, and impossible to completely eliminate from your basement. The really superstitious Victorians installed elaborate basement blessing systems, with blessed iron crucifixes mounted near coal storage areas, holy water sprinkled monthly on fuel piles, and sometimes even small altars built directly into cellar walls, where family members could pray for protection before venturing underground. Your basement became less of a storage area and more of an underground chapel, dedicated to supernatural pest control. Victorian basement construction reflected these demonic concerns, with builders incorporating specific design elements intended to discourage supernatural settlement. Basement windows were positioned to allow maximum natural light penetration, because demons supposedly couldn't tolerate prolonged exposure to sunshine. Some wealthy families installed basement skylights, essentially creating supernatural tanning beds that would burn any demons attempting to establish permanent residence. Coal storage protocols became elaborate rituals designed to prevent demonic contamination of fuel supplies. You'd arrange coal in specific patterns that supposedly disrupted supernatural energy flows, sprinkle blessed salt around storage areas, and never store coal directly against basement walls, where demons might use the earth connection to draw additional power from underground sources. Victorian children were absolutely prohibited from basement exploration, not because of safety concerns about structural hazards, but because young souls were supposedly delicious treats for coal demons who preferred innocent energy over adult spiritual nourishment. Parents installed multiple locks on basement doors and told terrifying bedtime stories about children who ventured underground and returned as speaking in ancient languages with glowing red eyes. Some Victorian families reported basement coal that burned with unusual colours or produced strange smoke patterns, interpreting these variations as evidence of demonic influence in their fuel supply. Remember those spiritual detection candles from earlier? Well, basement coal was essentially supernatural mood fuel that could reveal the spiritual state of your entire heating system through combustion analysis. The wealthy could afford professionally blessed coal shipments, with clergy performing spiritual purification ceremonies on fuel deliveries before they entered potentially demon-infested basements. Poor families relied on folk remedies like iron filings mixed with coal, protective herbs stored alongside fuel, and elaborate prayer rituals performed before each trip to the basement for heating supplies. The most disturbing Victorian basement accounts involve families who discovered that their coal demons had been feeding on household heat for years, gradually making their homes colder and more expensive to warm, while the supernatural entities grew stronger and more aggressive, essentially creating demonic utility parasites that were literally stealing warmth from living families. You're stepping out into your Victorian garden as twilight deepens, intending to gather herbs for tomorrow's cooking, when you freeze at your own garden gate. Because according to Victorian belief, the moment darkness falls, your peaceful backyard transforms into a supernatural highway where garden gate ghosts gather like cosmic toll collectors, demanding spiritual payment from anyone foolish enough to venture outdoors after sunset. Victorian gardens weren't just landscaped outdoor spaces. They were mystical borderlands between the civilized world of your home and the wild supernatural realm that existed beyond your property boundaries. Garden gates served as checkpoints in this spiritual frontier, places where ghostly entities supposedly congregated to monitor traffic between the domestic and otherworldly realms. Your innocent evening herb gathering became a supernatural border crossing that required proper spiritual documentation. The garden gate ghosts were supposedly different from indoor spirits. They were outdoor specialists who died while travelling and now spent eternity stationed at property entrances, unable to move on but unwilling to trespass on private land without permission. Victorians described them as translucent figures in travelling clothes, eternally waiting by gates and fences, ready to engage unwary homeowners in conversations that could last until dawn if you weren't careful about supernatural social etiquette. Historians still argue whether these gate ghost encounters were hallucinations caused by poor outdoor lighting and overactive imaginations, or genuine supernatural experiences shared across different families and geographic regions. But the stories were remarkably consistent. Travellers in period clothing, polite but persistent conversation attempts, and an overwhelming sense that these entities were somehow stuck in liminal spaces between destinations. But here's where Victorian garden paranoia reaches delightful levels of complexity. They believed that garden gate ghosts could provide valuable information about deceased relatives, future events, or hidden treasures, but only if you approach them with proper supernatural protocol. Simply rushing past a gate ghost was considered incredibly rude and might result in months of supernatural harassment, including mysteriously wilted plants, gates that wouldn't stay latched, and garden tools that disappeared overnight. The proper etiquette for gate ghost encounters involved elaborate greeting rituals that made Victorian social calls look casual. You'd approach the gates slowly, offer a respectful nod, and wait for the spirit to acknowledge your presence before attempting to pass. Some families developed specific phrases for gate ghost communication, essentially learning supernatural small talk to maintain good relationships with their otherworldly property monitors. Victorian garden design incorporated gate ghost considerations alongside aesthetic and practical concerns. Gates were positioned to provide clear sightlines in both directions, allowing living residents to spot supernatural visitors before accidentally startling them. Some wealthy families installed blessed gate hardware, with hinges and latches consecrated by clergy to ensure smooth supernatural relations while maintaining effective property security. The really paranoid Victorians avoided their gardens entirely after dark, preferring to lose evening outdoor time rather than risk gate ghost encounters. Families would complete all gardening tasks before sunset, essentially imposing supernatural curfews on their own outdoor activities. Remember those protective threshold rituals? Well, garden gates required similar spiritual maintenance, with families performing nightly blessing ceremonies to maintain positive relationships with their ghostly border guards. Victorian gardeners developed elaborate gate ghost appeasement strategies, leaving small offerings like flowers, herbs, or blessed water near garden entrances to show respect for supernatural property monitors. Some families maintained dedicated ghost gardens, small planted areas specifically designed to provide spiritual nourishment for gate ghosts, essentially creating supernatural bed and breakfast accommodations for travelling spirits who needed overnight accommodation. Children were taught specific gate ghost safety protocols, learning to recognise signs of supernatural presence, proper greeting techniques, and emergency procedures if ghost encounters became too intense or lengthy. Victorian parents worried that children might become too friendly with gate ghosts, potentially accepting invitations to join supernatural travels that would take them far from home and family. Some Victorian families reported beneficial relationships with their gate ghosts, receiving warnings about approaching storms, information about missing pets, or advance notice of unwelcome human visitors. These positive supernatural relationships required careful maintenance through consistent politeness, regular offerings, and respectful acknowledgement of the ghost's permanent resident status at family property boundaries. The most chilling gate ghost stories involved spirits who would offer to guide Victorian families to specific destinations, claiming knowledge of shortcuts or safer routes, but actually leading travellers into supernatural realms from which they might never return to the normal world. You're lying in your Victorian bed when the church bells begin their midnight chiming, and instead of feeling comforted by the familiar sound, you're gripping your blankets in terror. Because according to Victorian belief, church bells at night weren't just telling time. They were broadcasting supernatural weather reports that could predict deaths, announce ghostly arrivals, or warn of impending spiritual storms that would sweep through your neighbourhood like cosmic hurricanes. Victorian church bells weren't just religious instruments. They were mystical communication devices that supposedly transmitted messages between the earthly and spiritual realms. The theory was that bell bronze contained special properties that allowed sound waves to penetrate dimensional barriers, making every midnight chime a supernatural radio broadcast that announced otherworldly news to anyone spiritually sensitive enough to decode the mystical messages hidden in bronze reverberations. The bell interpretation system was incredibly complex and varied by church, denomination, and local folklore. Single tolls supposedly announced the arrival of beneficial spirits who'd come to bless the community, while rapid sequential chiming warned of malevolent entities approaching from the spiritual realm. The number of chimes, their rhythm, and even the pitch variations carried different supernatural meanings that Victorians learned to read like cosmic Morse code. Historians still argue whether Victorian bell fears stemmed from legitimate community warning systems used during emergencies, or genuine belief in supernatural communication through bronze instruments. But families treated nighttime bell interpretation as seriously as modern people check emergency broadcasts, gathering to discuss what the evening's chimes might mean for their household's spiritual safety. But here's where Victorian bell paranoia gets magnificently intricate. They believed that different churches broadcast different types of supernatural information. Anglican bells supposedly transmitted messages about deceased Anglican souls, while Catholic bells carried news from Catholic spirits, and Methodist bells delivered Methodist ghost updates. Your spiritual radio reception depended entirely on which denominational tower was doing the broadcasting. The really superstitious Victorians kept detailed bell journals, recording the time, number, and characteristics of every nighttime chime, then comparing these records to subsequent family events to identify patterns between supernatural broadcasts and real-world consequences. Some families claimed they could predict deaths, illnesses, or unexpected visitors days in advance through careful bell analysis, essentially creating supernatural weather forecasting based on bronze acoustics. Victorian children were taught to count bell chimes and report unusual patterns to their parents, turning bedtime into supernatural surveillance duty, where young ears served as early warning systems for otherworldly activity. Parents would wake children during significant bell sequences, ensuring the entire family stayed informed about potential spiritual developments that might affect household safety. Bell makers incorporated supernatural considerations into their craft, with some foundries advertising enhanced spiritual conductivity in their bronze alloys. Premium bells supposedly provided clearer supernatural reception, while cheaper bells might deliver garbled otherworldly messages that could be misinterpreted with potentially dangerous consequences. Your church's communication equipment required the same careful selection as any other critical community infrastructure. Some Victorian neighbourhoods developed collective bell interpretation societies, where families would gather after unusual nighttime chiming to discuss possible supernatural meanings and coordinate appropriate protective responses. Remember those garden gate ghosts? Well, bell warnings supposedly helped communities prepare for increased spiritual activity that might bring more supernatural visitors to local property boundaries. The wealthy could afford private bell consultants, specialists who claimed expertise in supernatural campanology and could provide professional interpretation of complex nighttime chiming patterns. Poor families relied on traditional folklore and community knowledge, but everyone participated in this nightly ritual of listening carefully to bronze broadcasts from the spiritual realm. Victorian bell fears reached such intensity that some families moved away from churches specifically to avoid nighttime supernatural broadcasts, preferring spiritual isolation over constant, otherworldly news updates. Other families chose homes based on proximity to churches, with reputations for accurate supernatural forecasting, essentially selecting neighbourhoods based on the quality of their mystical communication infrastructure. The most disturbing Victorian bell stories involved chimes that announced supernatural events with perfect accuracy, but provided no information about how to prevent or prepare for the predicted otherworldly occurrences, creating communities that lived in constant anticipation of spiritual disasters they knew were coming but couldn't avoid. You're sorting through your late husband's belongings when you discover his daguerreotype tucked behind a stack of letters, and as you lift the photograph to catch better light, you notice something chilling. His eyes in the image seemed to be looking directly at you, not at the camera, because according to Victorian belief, early photography didn't just capture images, it trapped actual pieces of human souls in silver and glass, creating supernatural prisons that could house the essence of everyone who'd ever posed for a portrait. Victorian photography wasn't just a new technology, it was accidental, soul-harvesting equipment that nobody fully understood. The theory was that cameras worked by stealing tiny fragments of spiritual essence from their subjects, which explained why some people felt drained after long photography sessions, and why certain photographs seemed unnaturally lifelike. Your innocent family portrait session became a supernatural transaction where you traded pieces of your soul for permanent visual records. The fear was so intense that many Victorians refused to be photographed at all, convinced that cameras were essentially spiritual vampires disguised as modern conveniences. Others limited themselves to single portraits per lifetime, believing that multiple photographs would gradually hollow out their souls until they became empty shells, walking around with their spiritual essence trapped in various photographic collections. Historians still argue whether Victorian photography fears stemmed from legitimate discomfort with new technology, or genuine supernatural experiences with haunted images. But families reported photographs that moved independently, changed expressions overnight, or showed figures that hadn't been present during the original session, suggesting that cameras might indeed be capturing more than just reflected light. But here's where Victorian photograph paranoia gets deliciously weird. They believed that photographs of deceased people retained the spiritual energy of their subjects, essentially creating portable haunted objects that could bring ghostly presences into your home. Your innocent memorial portrait of Great-Uncle Theodore might actually contain enough of his essence to allow him to observe your daily activities and occasionally rearrange your furniture when he disapproved of your housekeeping standards. The really superstitious Victorians stored photographs in blessed containers, treating family portraits like supernatural relics that required careful spiritual containment. Some families commissioned elaborate photograph blessing ceremonies from clergy, essentially having their images exorcised to prevent accidental soul trapping or ghostly animation of captured likenesses. Victorian photographers developed specialized techniques for spiritually safe portraiture, including specific lighting arrangements that supposedly minimized soul extraction, blessed camera equipment, and elaborate pre-session rituals designed to protect both subjects and operators from supernatural photography hazards. Professional photographers advertised their spiritual safety records alongside their artistic abilities, marketing soul preservation as a premium service feature. The wealthy could afford spirit-neutral photography equipment, with cameras blessed by multiple religious authorities and treated with protective oils and herbs. Poor families who couldn't afford professional spiritual safety measures often opted for painted portraits instead, believing that artistic interpretation was less likely to trap actual soul fragments than mechanical image capture. Children were considered especially vulnerable to photographic soul extraction, with parents limiting their photography exposure to prevent spiritual depletion during crucial developmental years. Remember those shadow people on staircases? Well, some Victorian families believed that photographed children were more likely to attract shadow people, who were supposedly drawn to souls that had been partially extracted through camera exposure. Victorian photograph albums became supernatural archives that required careful curation and protective maintenance. Families would organize their image collections according to spiritual as well as chronological considerations, keeping photographs of the living separate from images of the dead to prevent cross-contamination between ghostly and earthly essence trapped in the same album. The most chilling photographic stories involve portraits that accurately predicted their subjects' deaths, showing signs of illness or injury days before the actual events occurred, suggesting that cameras might be capturing not just current spiritual states, but future ones as well, essentially creating prophetic supernatural surveillance through mechanical image capture. You're fastening the delicate mourning brooch containing your mother's braided hair around your black silk collar when you feel a sudden chill run through your fingers. Because according to Victorian belief, mourning jewellery wasn't just sentimental keepsakes, it was supernatural radio equipment that maintained active spiritual connections between the living and the dead, essentially turning your fashion accessories into mystical communication devices that could channel otherworldly messages directly through your jewellery box. Victorian mourning jewellery wasn't just decorative remembrance. It was functional spiritual technology that supposedly kept deceased loved ones tethered to the earthly realm through physical artifacts. The theory was that hair, being the most spiritually conductive part of the human body, retained supernatural properties even after death, making jewellery crafted from deceased hair into powerful mystical antennas that could receive transmissions from beyond the grave. The hair jewellery creation process was treated like sacred ritual, with families carefully collecting locks from their deceased relatives before burial, then commissioning specialised jewellers who understood the spiritual significance of their materials. These craftsmen would weave intricate patterns using dead hair, creating brooches, rings and necklaces that looked beautiful but supposedly functioned as supernatural hotlines to the spirit world. Historians still argue whether mourning jewellery actually facilitated supernatural communication or just provided psychological comfort to grieving families. But Victorians reported jewellery that grew warm during emotional moments, changed colour to reflect the spiritual mood of deceased relatives, or even moved independently when supernatural messages were trying to be transmitted through the hair-based communication system. But here's where Victorian mourning jewellery gets magnificently complex. They believed different hair textures provided different types of spiritual connectivity. Fine hair supposedly offered delicate, nuanced communication with gentle spirits, while coarse hair created stronger connections that could handle more intense, otherworldly messages. Grey hair was considered premium spiritual conductor material, enhanced by years of accumulated life experience and wisdom. The really superstitious Victorians wore complete mourning jewellery sets, essentially creating supernatural communication networks across their entire bodies. You'd have hair brooches for heart-to-heart spiritual conversations, hair bracelets for hand-based mystical gestures, and hair earrings for enhanced supernatural hearing. Your fashion choices became less about appearance and more about optimizing otherworldly reception quality throughout your daily activities. Victorian mourning jewellery required careful spiritual maintenance, with families performing regular blessing ceremonies to keep the hair-based communication channels clear and prevent supernatural interference from unwanted spirits who might try to hijack the mystical connection. Some families hired professional mourning jewellery cleaners who specialised in both physical and spiritual maintenance of hair-based supernatural equipment. Children were taught proper mourning jewellery etiquette, learning to handle inherited pieces with reverence and understanding their potential for supernatural communication. Parents worried that children might accidentally activate spiritual connections they weren't mature enough to handle, potentially inviting deceased relatives into conversations about homework and bedtime that could escalate into full-scale otherworldly intervention in childhood discipline. The wealthy commissioned elaborate mourning jewellery collections that incorporated hair from multiple deceased family members, creating supernatural conference call capabilities that allowed simultaneous communication with entire extended families who crossed over to the spirit realm. Remember those seance mirrors? Well, mourning jewellery provided portable supernatural communication that didn't require elaborate parlour setups or professional medium assistance. Victorian jewellers developed specialised hair-working techniques that supposedly enhanced spiritual conductivity, including specific braiding patterns that improved otherworldly signal strength, blessed metalwork that amplified supernatural transmissions, and elaborate settings designed to protect the hair from spiritual contamination while maximising communication potential. Some Victorian families reported mourning jewellery that provided prophetic information about future family events, with deceased relatives apparently using hair-based communication channels to warn about upcoming dangers, announce approaching births, or provide guidance about important decisions. Your grandmother's hair brooch wasn't just memorial jewellery, it was supernatural life-coaching equipment that continued offering family guidance long after her earthly death. The most disturbing mourning jewellery stories involved pieces that seemed to develop independent personalities over time, with the hair apparently accumulating enough spiritual energy to begin making autonomous decisions about when and how to communicate, sometimes delivering unwanted supernatural advice or criticism that the original deceased relative would never have offered while living. You're preparing for bed in your Victorian home, moving through the elaborate nightly ritual that's kept your family safe from supernatural harm for generations, sprinkling salt across windowsills, covering mirrors with blessed cloth, positioning protective candles at strategic locations, and muttering the ancient words your grandmother taught you. Because according to Victorian wisdom, midnight protection charms weren't just bedtime superstitions. They were essential spiritual armour that could mean the difference between peaceful sleep and waking up possessed by demons who'd spent the night rearranging your soul. Victorian bedtime wasn't just about physical rest. It was about spiritual fortification against 8 hours of supernatural vulnerability when your unconscious mind couldn't actively defend against otherworldly intrusions. The midnight protection rituals combined elements from all the fears we've explored tonight, creating comprehensive defensive systems that addressed every possible supernatural threat your sleeping household might encounter. The complete protection ceremony typically began at sunset and continued until every family member was safely tucked into spiritually secure sleeping arrangements. You'd start by covering all mirrors to prevent soul trapping or demon portal activation, then sprinkle salt across every threshold to create spiritual barriers against uninvited supernatural visitors. Remember those shadow people on staircases? Well, protection charms included specific stair blessing rituals designed to prevent midnight encounters with lingering spirits. Historians still argue whether these elaborate protective rituals actually worked or just provided psychological comfort to anxious families, but Victorians approached bedtime spiritual defence with the same seriousness modern people apply to home security systems. The nightly protection routine was passed down through generations like precious family heirlooms, with each household developing personalised variations based on their specific supernatural experiences and regional folklore traditions. But here's where Victorian midnight protection reaches its most comprehensive form. Families would coordinate their individual protection rituals to create household-wide spiritual defence networks. Parents would perform master bedroom ceremonies, while children completed simplified versions in their rooms. Servants would bless kitchen and basement areas, and the entire family would conclude with group prayers that supposedly synchronized their individual protective barriers into unified supernatural fortresses. The protection charms incorporated elements from every supernatural fear we've discussed: iron nails to discourage demons, blessed herbs to repel malevolent spirits, specific prayers to maintain divine protection, and elaborate candle arrangements that provided both illumination and spiritual early warning systems. Your bedroom became less of a sleeping space and more of a temporary spiritual bunker designed to keep your unconscious mind safe from otherworldly predators. Victorian children learned simplified protection rituals appropriate for their age and spiritual development, including special bedtime prayers that supposedly created individual protective bubbles around their sleeping forms. Parents would check their children's protection setups multiple times each night, ensuring that salt lines remained unbroken, protective objects stayed properly positioned, and spiritual barriers maintained their integrity throughout the vulnerable sleeping hours. The wealthy could afford professional spiritual consultants who would design customized protection systems for their homes, incorporating blessed architectural elements, premium spiritual materials, and elaborate ceremony schedules that provided maximum supernatural security. Poor families relied on traditional folk methods and community knowledge, but everyone participated in these nightly rituals of spiritual self-defense against the unknown dangers that supposedly lurked in darkness. Some Victorian families reported that their protection charms became more effective over time, with repeated nightly ceremonies gradually strengthening the spiritual barriers around their homes. Multi-generational households supposedly enjoyed the strongest supernatural protection, layered with decades of accumulated blessing rituals and defensive ceremonies that created nearly impenetrable spiritual fortresses around sleeping family members. The most successful protection charms required absolute consistency and faith from every family member, with even small variations in ritual performance supposedly creating weak points that supernatural entities could exploit to breach otherwise effective spiritual defenses. Your midnight protection wasn't just personal insurance against ghostly harassment, it was family teamwork that kept everyone safe through collective spiritual vigilance and shared supernatural maintenance responsibilities. And so here you are, at the end of our midnight journey through Victorian supernatural fears, understanding now why your great-great-grandparents approached bedtime with such elaborate spiritual preparation. These weren't just quaint superstitions, they were comprehensive worldviews that acknowledged mysteries beyond everyday understanding, treating the invisible realm with respect, caution, and careful ritual attention. Perhaps there's something comforting in their approach, this recognition that the world contains more than what we can immediately see or scientifically measure. Their nightly protection rituals created structure, meaning, and community bonds around shared acknowledgement of life's deeper mysteries. Each covered mirror, each sprinkled salt line, each blessed candle represented hope that careful attention to spiritual details could provide genuine protection against unseen dangers. The Victorians lived in a world where death visited frequently and suddenly, where medical knowledge remained limited, where darkness held genuine physical dangers as well as imagined supernatural ones. Their elaborate protective rituals provided psychological comfort and social connection during uncertain times, creating shared meaning from common fears and collective responses to universal human anxieties about mortality, safety, and the unknown. Maybe tonight, as you settle into your modern bed with electric lights and scientific understanding, you can appreciate both how far we've come and what we might have lost along the way. The Victorians' willingness to acknowledge mystery, to treat the unseen with reverence, and to find meaning in ritual and community response to shared fears speaks to fundamental human needs that transcend any particular historical period. Your smartphone provides more light than any Victorian candle. Your door locks offer better security than blessed salt lines. And your understanding of natural phenomena explains most of the shadows and sounds that terrified our ancestors. But perhaps their approach to mystery, their respect for the unknown, and their commitment to protective community rituals contained wisdom worth remembering as you drift peacefully into sleep. Grateful for both modern knowledge and ancient human wisdom about navigating darkness with courage, preparation, and hope. You've earned rest now. Let the past hum quietly as you sleep, carrying both their fears and their wisdom gently into your dreams. Sweet dreams.